10 darkest myths in history people truly believed were real. For centuries, people didn't live with myths, they lived inside them. Entire villages turned on neighbors. Kings funded searches for impossible cities. Graves were opened because the dead were feared more than the living. And the most disturbing part, they weren't confused, they were convinced. Today, we explore 10 of the darkest myths in human history, beliefs that shaped laws, executions, wars, and mass panic. And as we go deeper, you'll notice something unsettling. Every myth starts the same way, with fear of the unknown. The witchcraft panic. When some places encountered accusations of witchcraft already equaled guilt, it became a bigger ordeal. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, in several regions of Europe, one of the largest moral panics in recorded history erupted. Witchcraft was no longer considered mere superstition, but rather it became a legal accusation. In places like the Holy Roman Empire, thousands of people were executed within just a few decades. Towns were hit with waves of trials where suspicion spread even faster than the evidence presented. What triggered these accusations was often trivial, an unsolved event like crop failure, illness, or a personal conflict. In societies without scientific basis for diseases or weather explanation, the blame needed to be placed on someone. That target became the witches. Interrogations were brutal and often ended with the extraction of confessions. Through the use of torture, even children were sometimes subjected to be called upon to testify against their parents. In some documented cases, whole family populations were accused and eliminated. It's the psychological aspect of this myth that's most widely concerning. Fear cultivates feedback loops. The further the execution rate increased, the more the system believed it was demonstrating proof against heresy. The system didn't set out to seek out witches. Instead, it actively created them. Vampire panic. They didn't fear death. They feared what came after it. In Eastern Europe, particularly during outbreaks of plague and tuberculosis, villagers began noticing disturbing changes in graves. Bodies appeared unusually preserved, sometimes bloated or with fluid at the mouth. Today, this is explained by decomposition processes and gas buildup. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, it looked like something unnatural. This misinterpretation led to widespread vampire panic. The Habsburg monarchy even conducted official investigations. Military officers were sent to rural villages to open graves, examine bodies, and confirm whether vampirism was spreading. Standard procedures included staking bodies, decapitation, or burning remains. These acts were seen as preventive medicine against supernatural infection. The psychological root of the myth was disease itself. When entire communities died from invisible pathogens, people needed a visible enemy. If you cannot see the cause, you will invent one you can destroy. The vampire myth is not just folklore, it is a reaction to unexplained mass death. The Wild Hunt. It wasn't just a story. It was something people believed they heard. The Wild Hunt appears in multiple European traditions, Germanic, Norse and Celtic, as a supernatural procession of riders racing through the sky or forests during storms. The leader varies by region: Odin in Norse myth, cursed nobles in German folklore, or death spirits in others. Witnesses described hearing horns, horses, and shouting during windstorms. Modern interpretations suggest these experiences were caused by acoustic phenomena, wind echoing through valleys, pressure changes, and auditory hallucinations in high-stress environments. But medieval societies had no framework for atmospheric science, so natural noise became interpreted as intentional movement. This myth influenced behavior significantly. People avoided travel during storms, feared sleeping near forests, and interpreted weather patterns as supernatural warnings. Nature was not random. It was watching. The Wild Hunt shows how humans transform unknown sensory input into structured fear. El Dorado. Imagine pushing through endless jungle, the air so thick you can barely breathe, watching people around you collapse one by one, yet you keep moving forward. Because somewhere ahead you believe there is a city where everything is made of gold. That belief cost thousands of lives, and it all began with a misunderstanding. El Dorado didn't originally describe a place. Covered in fine gold dust, he stood on a raft and offered treasures to the water. Gold wasn't wealth. It was sacred, symbolic, a bridge between humans and the divine. But when Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they misunderstood the story. To them, a man covered in gold meant unimaginable riches. And if such wealth existed, there had to be a source. So the idea evolved from a golden man to a hidden city of gold deep in the continent. Expeditions began. Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, Sebastián de Belalcázar, and Nicolas Federman approached from different directions. None found a golden city, but instead of ending the search, the myth simply moved deeper into the Amazon, further into the unknown. The journeys grew more desperate. Men died from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. In 1541, Francisco de Orellana crossed the Amazon River, losing most of his expedition. Survivors described endless rivers, hostile terrain, and the constant fear of never finding a way back. Still, even disasters like this didn't break the belief. In the late 16th century, Sir Walter Raleigh reignited the legend, claiming a powerful golden empire existed in South America. His accounts were never proven, but they inspired new expeditions and more deaths. Investors funded these journeys, convinced that unimaginable wealth was just one discovery away. What's most striking is the logic. Every failure didn't weaken the myth, it strengthened it. We just haven't found it yet. Was easier to accept than it doesn't exist. Hope kept replacing evidence. The cost was enormous. Entire regions were destabilized. Indigenous populations suffered violence, forced labor, and disease. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of deaths are linked to the search for El Dorado. By the 18th century, the searches faded. Maps became more accurate. The myth lost its credibility, but the story remained. El Dorado is more than a legend. It's a warning, a reminder of how powerful belief can become, strong enough to override reality. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't a lie. It's something people desperately want to believe. Dragons. Imagine living in a world where every unknown place on the map wasn't empty. It was dangerous, not unexplored, inhabited. And somewhere beyond the forests, beyond the mountains, beyond the edge of what people understood, there were dragons. In medieval Europe, dragons weren't seen as fantasy creatures. They were treated as real animals, rare, dangerous, but part of the natural world. Chronicles and bestiaries described them in surprisingly physical terms. Wings like bats, scales like armor, the ability to fly, breathe fire, and guard territory. These weren't fairy tales. They were recorded like observations. One reason for this belief was simple. People were constantly finding bones they couldn't explain. Across Europe and Asia, large fossil remains of dinosaurs, mammoths, and even whales were discovered long before the science of paleontology existed. Without a framework to understand extinction or prehistoric life, people interpreted these remains through the only system they had: myth. In some cases, these dragon bones were displayed as proof. Churches and royal collections kept massive skeleton fragments, presenting them as evidence of real creatures that once lived, or still lived, somewhere far away. In places like Austria and Germany, so-called dragon remains were shown to the public, reinforcing the idea that dragons were not just stories, but part of reality. Travel played another major role. Medieval Europe relied heavily on second-hand information. Merchants, sailors, and explorers returned from distant lands with stories of strange animals, giant reptiles, massive serpents, creatures no one back home had ever seen. Over time, these stories were exaggerated. A large crocodile could become a fire-breathing beast. A whale glimpsed at sea could transform into a sea dragon. And with every retelling, the creature grew more powerful, more terrifying, more real. Dragons also filled a psychological gap. Before scientific explanations, the world needed structure. Dangerous landscapes, volcanoes, deep caves, remote mountains were often associated with dragons. If something was unexplained, it wasn't random. It was guarded, claimed, alive. But dragons weren't only feared, they were also used. European rulers adopted dragon imagery as a symbol of power. A king who bore a dragon on his banner wasn't just invoking fear, he was aligning himself with it. The dragon represented dominance over chaos, control over the unknown. In that sense, it became political authority. It wasn't just about ruling people, it was about mastering the world itself. Some medieval texts even went further, attempting to classify dragons. Different types were described based on where they lived: mountains, caves, water, and how they behaved. These descriptions read less like myths and more like early attempts at zoology. Writers weren't inventing creatures for entertainment. They were trying to document what they believed was real. What makes this story so fascinating is not that people believed in dragons, it's why they believed. Because in a world without modern science, imagination wasn't separate from knowledge, it was part of it. When evidence was incomplete, the mind filled in the gaps. And those explanations, repeated over generations, became accepted truth. By the time science began to develop, bringing fields like biology and paleontology, the need for dragons faded. Fossils were reinterpreted. Strange animals were identified. The unknown slowly became known. But for centuries, dragons were never questioned. They were studied, described, catalogued. Because when knowledge is missing, belief doesn't disappear. It takes its place. The Flying Dutchman. If you see it at sea, you are already beyond rescue. The legend of the Flying Dutchman has haunted sailors for more than 3 centuries, and yet no one has ever proven that the ship actually exists. The story first begins to take shape in the 17th century, during the so-called Golden Age of Sail, when Dutch merchant fleets dominated global trade routes across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. It was an era of long voyages, brutal storms, and ships that often vanished without explanation. Around the late 1600s, maritime folklore starts mentioning a cursed vessel, commanded by a stubborn captain who refused to turn back even when his crew begged him to avoid a deadly storm near the Cape of Good Hope. In some versions recorded later in the 18th century, the captain is said to have sworn an oath against God or fate itself, condemning his ship to sail forever, and from that point on, the myth begins to spread. By the 18th and 19th centuries, sailors from different navies, British, Dutch, and even Scandinavian, report seeing something unusual at sea. A ship appearing in impossible conditions, sometimes glowing faintly in the mist, sometimes sailing directly against the wind, and always, according to these accounts, disappearing without a trace when approached. One of the most famous early written mentions comes from naval logs in the late 1700s and early 1800s, where officers describe a phantom vessel seen during storms in the South Atlantic. These reports are inconsistent in detail, but strangely consistent in theme, a ship that should not be there, and yet is. By the 19th century, the legend becomes part of maritime culture. The name Flying Dutchman becomes widely used, especially among British sailors, as a warning sign, an omen of bad luck or impending disaster. In some ship crews, even claiming to have seen it was considered bad fortune. But modern analysis suggests a different explanation. Meteorologists and physicists point to a phenomenon known as fata morgana, a complex form of superior mirage. It occurs when layers of air at different temperatures bend light in unusual ways, often over the ocean. This can distort distant objects, sometimes turning normal ships into floating, ghost-like shapes that appear elevated above the water or stretched into unnatural forms. Combined with fog, storms, and low visibility, these optical effects can easily mislead even experienced sailors. There is also the psychological factor. Long voyages at sea in the 17th to 19th centuries meant weeks or even months of isolation, sleep deprivation, and constant environmental stress. In such conditions, the human brain becomes highly suggestible. It begins to interpret ambiguous shapes, waves, reflections, shadows, as meaningful objects, especially something as culturally powerful as a ghost ship. Yet what makes the Flying Dutchman story so persistent is not just what sailors might have seen, but what they feared. The ocean, for most of human history, was not just a route of travel. It was an unknown space where people disappeared permanently. No communication, no rescue, no certainty. In that environment, the idea of a cursed ship endlessly sailing the same waters becomes more than a story. It becomes a symbol of being lost without end. Even today, in the age of satellites and GPS navigation, the Flying Dutchman survives in books, films, and maritime folklore, not because it has been proven real, but because it represents something deeply human, the fear that somewhere, below the edge of certainty, things can still go wrong and never resolve. And perhaps that is why the legend refuses to disappear, because in the middle of the ocean, where everything looks the same and time feels endless, even imagination can start to look like reality. Werewolf. Imagine being accused not just of murder, but of becoming an animal to commit it. Not metaphorically, literally. In 16th century Europe, people were executed for transforming into wolves. This wasn't folklore told around fires. It was treated as a real crime. Between the 1500s and early 1600s, regions of France and the fragmented states of the Holy Roman Empire became the center of what historians now call the werewolf trials. These cases often overlapped with the more widely known witch hunts, sharing the same courts, the same methods of interrogation, and the same atmosphere of fear. One of the most infamous cases took place in 1573. A man named Gilles Garnier, known as the Werewolf of Dole, was accused of brutally killing and eating children. According to trial records, Garnier confessed, under torture, that a spirit had given him an ointment allowing him to transform into a wolf. He described stalking victims in the forest, attacking them and consuming their flesh. He was found guilty and burned at the stake. But Garnier was not alone. In 1589, another case shocked Germany. Peter Stump, sometimes called the Werewolf of Bedburg, was accused of a series of murders, including those of women and children. His confession, also extracted under torture, claimed he used a magical belt to become a wolf. The punishment was exceptionally brutal. His body was broken on the wheel before execution. Today, these stories sound like dark fantasy, but at the time they were recorded as legal fact. So what was really happening? Historians point to a combination of factors. Europe during this period was experiencing severe instability. Famine, disease, and social unrest were widespread. In many regions, wolf populations had increased, leading to real attacks on livestock and occasionally humans. At the same time, centralized legal systems were weak, and fear often replaced evidence. Psychologically, the werewolf became a convenient explanation. When violence was too extreme, too disturbing to accept as purely human, societies created a framework that made it easier to process. Transformation myths allowed people to separate the act from the person. Instead of asking how a human could commit such brutality, they asked what monster had taken control. There's also evidence that some accused individuals may have suffered from mental illnesses, such as clinical lycanthropy, a rare condition where a person believes they can transform into an animal. Combined with torture, leading questions, and public panic, confessions became almost inevitable. What makes these trials so disturbing is not the idea of werewolves, but how real the consequences were. Courts documented them, authorities prosecuted them, executions were carried out in public. Because in a world without scientific explanations for extreme behavior, fear demanded something tangible, and a human killer was unacceptable. A monster was easier to understand,